Welcome, dear listeners. If hell had manners, it would look exactly like the kitchen of Haverly House. The fires roared hot enough to melt sin itself. The air was thick with steam and swearing, and somewhere in the chaos stood Margaret Wicklow, queen of the damned and mistress of the pudding. While the family upstairs fretted over lace and table manners, Margaret commanded her army of weary souls below, armed with ladles instead of lances, waging war against time, temper, and undercooked fowl, the smell of roasting meat mixed with coal smoke and despair, and yet somehow dinner was always served on time, proof perhaps that the devil prefers a well-fed house. Before we begin, be sure to like, share, and subscribe only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It's super amazing how there are so many viewers across the world who enjoys this type of content. Please be sure to drop a comment below to let me know what part of the world you're listening from. I would truly appreciate that. Now lay back, relax, maybe have some wine with a cozy blanket, and let's travel together, way, way back together. Her name was Margaret Wicklow, though in the kitchen she was known simply as Cook. She was 52 years old, round of face, short of breath, and as unmovable as the great oak table that dominated her domain below stairs. But Margaret had not always ruled with such authority. She was born in 1768 in the fishing village of Whitstable, on the Kentish coast, the second daughter of a netmaker and his wife, a woman who forever smelled of brine and barley soup. The Wicklows had little more than a shared bed, a cracked kettle, and the daily rhythm of tide and toil. From an early age, Margaret learned that life's fortunes rose and fell like the sea, capricious, cold, and occasionally merciful. When she was 12, her mother died in childbirth, and the house became a place of quiet grief. Her father took to the bottle, and her older sister found work as a maid in Canterbury. It was the local vicar's wife who took pity on young Margaret, noticing the way the girl's hands moved deftly when she helped at parish feasts, chopping herbs, plucking fowl, and stirring stews until they thickened to perfection. It was she who arranged for Margaret to be placed in service, first as a scullery maid at a modest inn on the London road, where the air always carried the scent of grease, ale, and horse dung. There, she learned the lowest form of kitchen labour, scrubbing pots until her fingers bled, fetching water from the pump at dawn, and sleeping among sacks of onions. Yet it was there she found her calling, the rhythm of knives against wood, the hiss of fat, the sacred moment when hunger met its remedy. By 19, Margaret had worked her way into the kitchens of a small country house belonging to a retired colonel and his wife. The mistress was fond of elaborate puddings, the master of venison pies, and both were fond of complaining. But Margaret learned to listen. She discovered that the secret to keeping one's position was not perfection, but quiet endurance. When the colonel's gout kept him in foul temper, Margaret invented soups light enough to soothe him. When his wife quarrelled with her guests, Margaret distracted her with new recipes. Her hands grew strong, her sense of taste sharper. By the time the colonel passed away, she had the reputation of being a woman who could make even a boiled carrot sing. Now, in her 50s, she presided over the kitchens of Haverly House, a Georgian estate of pale stone and towering windows, owned by the Fairchild family. Old money, new gossip. The mistress, Lady Eleanor Fairchild, prided herself on refinement. Her husband, Lord Fairchild, prided himself on spending. Between them, they hosted endless dinners meant to impress, and it was Margaret's task to ensure that everything from the turtle soup to the syllabub arrived at table in flawless sequence. Below stairs, she commanded a small army: the kitchen maid, the scullery girl, 2 footmen who fetched and carried, and a boy too young to shave but old enough to fear her temper. The kitchen was her kingdom. Heat shimmered from the coal range, pots simmered and spat. The air was thick with the perfume of roasting meats, singed sugar, and soap. A copper jelly mould gleamed like a relic in candlelight, and from the pantry came the faint rustle of flour sifted into wooden bowls. Margaret's voice cut through it all, calm but unchallengeable. "Mind the pudding cloth, Alice." Tight but not strangled, the girl obeyed without question. Upstairs, they might not remember Cook's Christian name, but downstairs, her word was law. Sometimes, when the day's work was done and the last dish sent upstairs, Margaret would sit by the dying fire, sipping a little leftover sherry meant for the master. In that dim light, she would think of her own mother's kitchen, a smoky room with one pot and endless hunger, and feel a strange satisfaction. for though she worked in the service of others, the kitchen belonged to her in a way nothing else ever had. Every clatter, every smell, every scrape of spoon against pot was the sound of her authority. Above stairs, Lady Fairchild might wear silk and diamonds, but below stairs, Margaret wore the crown. The morning after a grand dinner was always the quietest in the kitchen. A faint smell of spent tallow and last night's gravy lingered in the air, mingling with the sweetness of rising dough. Margaret sat at the long oak table, sleeves rolled up, nursing a cup of weak tea. Around her, the younger staff crept about softly, still wary of disturbing her. On the range, a new pot began to hiss, and outside, the faint toll of the church bell in the village marked the beginning of another day. Margaret was not without family, though they existed more as echoes than daily company. She had once been married to a carpenter named Thomas Wicklow, a quiet man with kind eyes and a back bent by honest labour. They had met in her 20s during her years at the Colonel's household. He had been repairing the servants' staircase, and she, carrying a basin of milk, had slipped and nearly toppled into him. He steadied her, and something about his patience, the steadiness of his hands, the unhurried way he smiled, softened her heart. They married modestly, with 2 pewter rings and a loaf of bread between them. For a few short years, they rented a small cottage near London's edge. Their first child, Edwin, came in the summer of 1792, when the air hung heavy and the milk turned sour before dawn. A daughter, Clara, followed 3 years later, but Thomas's health began to falter. The dust from the carpentry, they said, or perhaps something deeper in his lungs. He died when Clara was only 7. Margaret buried him in a churchyard where wild thyme grew over the stones and returned to service to keep the children fed. Her hands, already rough from work, grew rougher still, but her heart hardened in silence. Now, decades later, Edwin was a clerk in Portsmouth with children of his own, 2 boys who sent her the occasional letter with inky fingerprints. Clara had married a tailor and lived in Bath, and though Margaret had not seen her in years, she sometimes imagined her daughter's hands smoothing fine cloth over her lap, the same way Margaret smoothed pastry. They wrote now and again, always beginning with "My dearest mother," and ending with "We hope you are keeping well below stairs." It was the sort of distance the world expected between a servant and her kin. When the Fairchild's children, delicate, perfumed and impatient, came down to the kitchen for a forbidden treat, Margaret would watch them and think of her own long-grown babies. She was gentle with the Fairchild children, though never indulgent. No good pudding was ever rushed, she would tell them when they begged to taste too soon. Sometimes Lady Eleanor herself would appear at the door, a silken shadow in her morning gown, to ask whether the oysters had arrived or if the milkman's boy had been properly scolded for tardiness. Lady Eleanor always spoke to Margaret as though she were both invisible and indispensable, a curious balance of the Georgian household. At midday, the household rhythm quickened again, pigeons to be plucked, a calf's foot jelly to be set, and bread to be scored before baking. The young scullery maid, Alice, looked half asleep as she polished the copper pans, and Margaret's voice snapped her awake. "A lazy hand makes a spotted pan, girl." Yet the rebuke was not unkind. There was a touch of memory in it. Margaret had been that girl once, small and hungry, eyes stinging from smoke. When evening fell and the family dined upstairs, laughter and music floating faintly through the ceiling, Margaret and her small crew sat around the kitchen hearth. The footman teased the kitchen maid, the scullery girl dozed against the wall, and the stable boy snuck in for leftovers. Margaret rarely spoke then. She liked to listen, to the crackle of fire, to the murmurs of young voices, to the clink of spoons in bowls. For in these moments she saw the cycle turning again, one generation rising from soot and scrubbing, dreaming of gentler futures. Sometimes, when the candles burned low, she would trace the edge of her wedding ring, still on her finger, worn thin as wire, and whisper a quiet good night to Thomas. She wondered what he would think of her now, mistress of the kitchen in a grand house, respected and feared in equal measure. Perhaps he would have laughed softly and said, "You've built yourself a kingdom, Maggie." And perhaps, she thought, he would have been right. That evening, Haverly House glowed like a lantern in the mist. From the drive above stairs came the rhythmic clip of carriage wheels and the calls of liveried coachmen. Inside, the grand dining room shimmered with candlelight reflected in silver and glass. Below stairs, it was another world entirely, one of heat, clatter, and sweat. The great kitchen clock ticked solemnly above the din. Margaret Wicklow stood before the long table, arms folded, surveying the controlled chaos with the calm of a general before battle. The footmen hovered near the door, their coats already darkened at the armpits with nervous sweat. The kitchen maid was basting a joint of beef that glistened beneath a tide of gravy, while Alice, the scullery girl, polished the last serving spoons with a rag that had seen better days. "Mind the sauce, mind the fire," Margaret murmured, more to herself than anyone. She had learned long ago that panic was contagious. Better to breathe steady, move steady, and keep the air thick only with steam, not fear. Tonight's menu had been dictated by Lady Fairchild herself, a blend of fashion and folly. Turtle soup, roast beef, pigeons in pastry, blancmange with rose water, and fruit pyramids, she had said, her gloved finger tapping the list with authority. And cook, do make it elegant, not rustic. Lord Balcombe's chef is French. Margaret had smiled politely, her thoughts unspoken. French cooking, she thought, made more fuss than flavour. The turtle soup was already simmering, thick, greenish, and fragrant with Madeira. She stirred it, letting the scent rise and coil through the air, the way memory sometimes did. She had made the same soup 20 years ago, in another house, for another mistress who fancied herself refined. Time changed the faces upstairs, but not the demands. A crash broke her reverie, the sound of a dropped platter. "Saints above," Margaret hissed, spinning around. The kitchen maid, red-faced, held the shards of what had once been a pudding mould. For a heartbeat, the kitchen froze. Then Margaret simply sighed, wiped her hands on her apron, and said, "Get another." Quickly, before the custard sulks, her voice carried no anger, just certainty. The moment passed. Upstairs, a bell rang. The first course. Footmen lined up, trays balanced, eyes darting toward her for permission. Margaret nodded once. The great machine of dinner began to turn. Between courses, she oversaw everything, carving meat with the precision of a surgeon, arranging garnishes so that even the most bored guest might glance twice. The scullery clanked with the ghosts of past meals. When the fruit pyramids were assembled, a riot of grapes, peaches, and sugared cherries, Margaret stood back to inspect them. Her back ached, her wrists burned, but she would not rest yet. It was then that Lady Eleanor herself swept in, a flutter of satin and perfume utterly out of place among the copper and soot. "Cook," she said, her tone carrying that peculiar mix of gratitude and condescension. The turtle soup was adequate, but the blancmange, could it not tremble a little less? Margaret inclined her head, eyes lowered. "I'll have the next set firmed with a touch more isinglass, my lady." "Do," said Lady Eleanor. "It's rather important one's dessert not look frightened." When she had gone, the servants exchanged glances, half amusement, half pity. Margaret said nothing, only reached for a spoon to stir the blancmange with deliberate calm. "Fear," she murmured, "is for fools and flan alike. We set, we serve, and we survive." Hours later, when the guests had left and the house had fallen still, the kitchen exhaled. The coal range glowed dully, the dishes stood stacked in gleaming rows. The air, at last, cooled. Margaret removed her apron, hanging it on its peg with the reverence of a priest setting down vestments. In the quiet, she poured herself a thimble of leftover port. Her reflection in the blackened kettle looked older than she felt, or perhaps exactly as old as she was. She thought of her children, her husband, the endless feasts she had prepared for people who would never remember her name. Yet she did not feel forgotten. Every meal that left her kitchen was a kind of proof that she had turned hunger and labour into something close to art. She sipped the port, listening to the faint creak of the beams above, and smiled faintly. "A trembling blancmange," she whispered. "I suppose we're all trembling one way or another." Then she banked the fire, the last ember sighing into darkness, and the kingdom below stairs fell into gentle sleep. The next morning, a pale wash of winter light spilled through the narrow windows of the servants' hall, falling across the flagstones in thin silver stripes. The air still smelled faintly of the night before, the ghost of roasted meat and Madeira lingering in every shadowed corner. Margaret Wicklow was already awake. She had been up since before dawn, her feet finding their familiar path across the kitchen without the need for a candle. She moved with the quiet rhythm of long habit, checking the larder, testing the chill in the pantry, running her hand across the flour sacks to make sure no damp had crept in overnight. On the table, a fresh loaf cooled beside a crock of butter, and the kettle began to hum softly on the range. The rest of the household would not stir for another hour, but below stairs, the day had already begun. Alice, the scullery girl, crept in, rubbing her eyes, and Margaret handed her a slice of bread before she could even speak. "Eat first," she said gently. "You can't wash dishes on an empty stomach." The girl smiled shyly, surprised by the kindness. Margaret had a reputation for being stern, but her sternness was like a good crust, hard on the outside to protect what was soft beneath. Soon the kitchen came alive again, the thump of kneading, the hiss of the fire, the rhythmic scrape of a knife against a wooden board. Margaret oversaw it all, issuing instructions in her low, steady voice. There was no shouting, no flurry, only the slow heartbeat of a well-run kitchen. By mid-morning, the first stirrings came from above, the muffled sound of Lady Fairchild's bell and the rustle of silk on the stairs. A footman appeared at the door, cheeks flushed from running. "Cook," he said breathlessly. "Her ladyship requests tea and toast, lightly done, with marmalade if it's fresh." Margaret nodded, already reaching for the marmalade pot. "Tell her ladyship it was sealed only yesterday, and tell her the bread's baked this morning." When the footman left, Alice leaned closer. "Do they ever thank you, cook?" she asked timidly. Margaret paused, knife in hand, then smiled faintly. "Not in words, child, but the plates come back empty. That's thanks enough." Upstairs, Lady Eleanor sat by her window, sipping tea and commenting idly to her maid about the success of last night's dinner. "Everything was splendid, of course," she said, "though I must say the blancmange trembled less than usual. Perhaps cook is finally learning restraint." The maid nodded politely, hiding a smile. Down below, Margaret's world continued, its own quiet orbit beneath the grand universe above. At midday, when the servants gathered for their meal, stew thick with onions, a heel of bread, and a jug of small beer, the kitchen filled with laughter. The footman recounted gossip from the dinner table, the stable boy boasted about a horse that nearly threw a groom, and Alice listened wide-eyed, her hands clasped around her mug. Margaret ate slowly, listening. The warmth of companionship was a rare luxury below stairs, and she let herself sink into it for a moment. Afterwards, when the younger ones dispersed, she lingered by the hearth. Through the small window she could see a sliver of the garden, frost still clinging to the hedges, a robin hopping along the path. It reminded her of her own garden long ago, behind the little cottage she and Thomas had once shared. She used to grow parsley and carrots there, and he'd built her a small bench from the offcuts of his carpentry. She could almost smell the earth again, the scent of wet soil and sawdust. Sometimes she wondered what her life might have been had Thomas lived longer, had she never come to Haverly House. Would she have kept a small bake shop, raised her grandchildren close by instead of through letters that smelled faintly of other towns? The thought brought a faint ache to her chest, though it wasn't regret exactly, more like a tenderness for all the roads she never walked. The kitchen door opened, letting in a draught of cold air and the scent of the stable yard. It was the delivery boy, carrying a crate of fish packed in ice. Margaret thanked him, inspected the catch, and gave him a heel of bread for the road. "That'll warm you better than your master's wages," she said kindly. As the day waned, the light in the kitchen turned golden, catching the dust motes in slow dance. Margaret moved quietly through her realm, tidying, planning, preparing for another night of unseen glory. Her back ached, her hands were stiff, yet her spirit was calm. The world above might glitter, but it was her steady labour that kept it turning. And when twilight fell and the house settled into its two worlds again, candlelight above, firelight below, Margaret Wicklow sat by the embers, her apron folded, her teacup steaming. In her quiet, unacknowledged way, she was content. That evening, long after the day's last pot had been scoured and the kitchen's great range had dimmed to a low red glow, Margaret Wicklow sat alone at the long table. The others had gone to their bunks, the kitchen maid exhausted, the scullery girl half asleep before she even reached her cot. The house was silent now, save for the slow ticking of the clock and the occasional creak of timber settling in the cold. Margaret unpinned a small folded letter from the corner of the mantel where she kept such treasures. The paper was creased, the edges soft from being opened too often. The ink had bled slightly where a child's unsteady hand had written her name. Dear Grandmama. It was from Edwin's youngest, little Joseph, whose letters always came in fits of enthusiasm and blotched spelling. She unfolded it carefully, as though it might crumble with too much haste. Dear Grandmama, Papa says you are a very fine cook and that you once made a pie fit for a king. I told the boys at school and they didn't believe me, but I said you could make anything taste good, even turnips. Please send your recipe for plum pudding. Mama says yours is the best in England. Your loving grandson, Joseph. Margaret smiled, her eyes softening. The letter smelled faintly of lamp oil and sea air. Portsmouth, she thought. She ran her thumb over the last line and chuckled under her breath. Even turnips, she murmured. The child's not wrong. She reached for her writing box, an old wooden one Thomas had made her when they were first married. The hinges squeaked in protest, but inside it lay her modest treasures, a scrap of sealing wax, a stub of pencil, a pressed sprig of lavender, and several carefully folded letters from her children. She drew out a clean sheet of paper, smoothed it with the flat of her hand, and dipped her pen in the inkwell. Her handwriting was neat and plain, the script of a woman who learned her letters by copying church notices and recipe books. My dearest Joseph, you must tell your friends that a good pie is made not for kings, but for hungry bellies. The secret to plum pudding is patience and a steady hand. Both take practice. One day when I visit, I shall make it with you. Until then, help your mother when she bakes. It pleases me to think you may have a cook's touch in your fingers. Your loving Grandmama, Margaret Wicklow. She sanded the ink and set it aside to dry. There was no telling when she might have the chance to send it. Letters from servants were often delayed until some errand or cart made the trip to town. Still, it comforted her to write, to place a small piece of herself into words. Outside, a wind was rising. The branches of the beech trees brushed against the kitchen windows, whispering like old gossip. Margaret rose and fed the fire one last scoop of coal. The light flared briefly, gilding the copper pots along the wall. Each one caught the glow and held it, like tiny suns refusing to go dark. She turned then, slowly, her joints stiff but her movements graceful with long habit. Her eyes drifted around the room, the table worn smooth by decades of chopping and rolling, the range scarred by countless fires, the shelves lined with jars labelled in her tidy hand. Nutmeg, treacle, sweet, clove. This had been her life's work, though no plaque or portrait would ever mark it. And yet, she thought, something of her would remain. In every recipe passed on, in every servant she had taught, in every small kindness offered between orders. Even in the way Alice now stirred the stew without burning it, there was a trace of Margaret's patience. She sat once more, the letter folded beside her, and allowed her thoughts to drift to her grandchildren. She imagined their voices, their laughter, their busy little hands stealing raisins when their mother wasn't looking. She imagined one of them, perhaps Joseph himself, standing one day at a kitchen table, repeating something she had once said. A lazy hand makes a spotted pan, girl. The thought made her smile. The fire crackled, and a faint warmth spread through the room. Margaret closed her eyes, her head resting against the chair's high back. The world above stairs might forget her name, but below she had built something lasting. Not a legacy of marble or money, but of care, the kind that filled bellies, softened tempers, and made a house for a few brief hours each day feel alive. Her breathing slowed, the clock ticked on. In her kingdom below stairs, Margaret Wicklow, the cook of Haverly House, finally allowed herself a moment of quiet rest, the kind that belongs only to those who have fed the world and asked nothing in return. Years passed quietly, the way years often do for those who live by routine. The seasons turned in soft procession, frost to blossom, blossom to harvest, and harvest to frost again. Haverly House remained much the same, its marble columns unchanged, its owners aging only in degrees of vanity. But below stairs, time left clearer marks. The servants came and went, growing older or marrying or fading from the household's rhythm, yet Margaret Wicklow remained, constant as the kitchen range. By her late 60s, her once dark hair had turned silver grey, bound neatly beneath her cap. Her hands were knotted with years of kneading and lifting, but still sure, still capable of coaxing perfection from stubborn dough. The young maids now called her Mrs. Wicklow with a mix of reverence and affection. Even Lady Eleanor, older, heavier, and quieter since her husband's passing, had grown almost deferential in her manner. "I don't know what I shall do when you retire, cook," she once remarked, standing awkwardly in the doorway as if intruding upon sacred ground. Margaret had smiled, not unkindly. "You'll eat," she said simply. "You'll find another woman to feed you. That's the way of things." But when she returned to her work that night, she paused longer than usual over her recipes, each one handwritten, annotated in her small, careful script. They were the map of her life, really, inked in grease, spotted with age, carrying the ghosts of every household she'd served. Pigeon pie, turtle soup, lemon syllabub. Her own handwriting seemed to look back at her from another century. The day she decided to leave came quietly, without fanfare. The kitchen was warm, the morning bright. She had been kneading bread when a tremor ran through her wrist, small but unmistakable. It was not pain that startled her, but weakness. For the first time, she realized she could no longer trust her hands to obey without protest. She looked around the kitchen, at Alice, now grown into a capable cook in her own right, giving gentle orders to a scullery boy, and she knew the kingdom no longer needed its queen. Lady Eleanor wept, of course, in her reserved, perfumed way. "You must visit us, Mrs. Wicklow. You've been part of this house longer than the furniture." Margaret promised she would, though both women knew she would not. The rhythm of her life did not belong to parlours and tea visits. It belonged to the slow, smoky hum of kitchens, and she was wise enough to let that music end in peace. Her son Edwin had long since invited her to live with his family in Portsmouth, and so she went. The journey by carriage was tiring. She had not travelled far in decades, but when she arrived, the smell of the sea struck her like a memory. The gulls, the salt wind, the echo of her own childhood in Whitstable. It was as though the world had turned full circle. Her grandchildren greeted her with shy excitement, the youngest carrying a bunch of daisies for the famous cook. They had heard stories, of course, of their grandmother who once cooked for lords and ladies, whose puddings could win praise from bishops, whose soups could calm the fiercest tempers. Margaret laughed softly and ruffled their hair. "Well," she said, "you've been told nonsense, but it's kind nonsense." Her days settled into a gentle rhythm, smaller kitchen, humbler fare. She baked bread for the family, helped her daughter-in-law with stews, and sometimes sat in the garden with a blanket over her knees, watching the light play on the water. She missed the old sounds, the kitchen clatter, the crack of wood in the range, the murmur of servants below stairs. But she did not mourn them. She had given her life to that world, and it had given her purpose in return. One afternoon, years later, she sat by the window overlooking the harbour. The sun was low, painting the sea in sheets of gold. Her hands rested quietly in her lap, folded over one another. Beside her, a young girl, her granddaughter, Clara's namesake, was carefully stirring a bowl of batter. "Not too fast," Margaret murmured. "Gentle. The secret is to let the air stay inside." The girl giggled. "Like a secret?" Margaret smiled. "Exactly like a secret." The smell of baking drifted through the cottage. Butter, sugar, nutmeg. For a moment, she could almost believe she was back in Haverly House, her kitchen alive around her. But then a gull cried outside, and she felt the soft weight of the present return. The girl tugged her sleeve. "Grandmama, when I grow up, I want to cook just like you." Margaret looked at her, bright-eyed, flower on her cheek, and felt a warmth deeper than any fire. "Then you'll never go hungry, my dear," she said softly, "and the world will always have need of you." That night, after the house had gone quiet, she sat once more by the dying fire. Her thoughts drifted like the tide, toward Thomas, toward Haverly House, toward all the faces she had fed and forgotten. Life had been a long meal, she thought, full of work, warmth and noise, and she had never left the table hungry. Outside, the sea whispered against the shore. Margaret Wicklow closed her eyes, listening to that steady rhythm, the same rhythm that had carried her through every kitchen, every day, every breath. The years in Portsmouth unfolded like a slow, contented exhale. Margaret settled into her son's household not as a guest, but as something sturdier, the quiet spine around which the little home bent and breathed. She rose early out of habit, long before the rest, to set the kettle and watch the morning light creep across the harbour. Ships came and went like migrating thoughts, their sails bright against the grey horizon. She never tired of that sight. It reminded her that the world still moved, even if she no longer needed to chase it. The Wicklow cottage smelled perpetually of bread and polish. Edwin had built her a small corner in the kitchen, a low stool, a work table near the window, and a peg for her apron. His wife, Marjorie, was a good-natured woman, though nervous around Margaret at first. It's difficult to cook alongside a legend after all, but Margaret had no interest in reigning here. She offered help only when asked, and encouragement more often than correction. "A stew can be like a marriage," she told Marjorie once with a wry smile. "Too much stirring, and you spoil it." The grandchildren adored her. They followed her like ducklings whenever she went to market, proud to carry the basket, chattering about school and ships and future adventures. Margaret listened, rarely interrupting, except to point out a bargain or compliment a fishmonger's catch. The vendors soon came to know her as Granny Wicklow, the polite, silver-haired woman with the sharp eye and the cook's instinct for quality. When she tasted a wedge of cheese or pressed a loaf to test its crust, her approval was a small event in itself. Sometimes, on quiet afternoons, she received letters from Alice, her former kitchen maid at Haverly House, now the cook of a fine estate herself. Alice's handwriting was larger, more confident, but her tone still deferential. "Mrs. Wicklow, I've thought of you often, especially when the sauces turn against me. The new lady likes everything boiled within an inch of its life, but I try to keep my standards. I tell the girls what you used to say. A kitchen should sound like a heartbeat, not a battlefield. I hope you are keeping well." Margaret would smile when she read these lines, sometimes even aloud. "A heartbeat, not a battlefield," she repeated softly. "Ah, good girl." Her health began to slow her, though not in ways that pained her much. Her hands trembled now and then, and she often forgot names, but her sense of taste never dulled. On good days, she baked small fruit tarts and lined them up on the sill to cool. On bad days, she simply sat by the fire and let the kettle sing for her. Edwin, busy with his clerking work, often worried over her. "You do too much, Mother," he said. "You've earned your rest." Margaret only chuckled. "I've been resting since the day I stopped cooking for ladies," she said. "This is the good part, boy, when no one sends for you and the bread rises anyway." Yet some nights, when the wind rose and the sea groaned like an old door, she found herself remembering the echo of Haverly House, the ring of the service bell, the bustle before dinner, the laughter she only ever heard through floors. Those sounds belonged to another world now, but they came back to her dreams as vividly as ever. Sometimes she woke thinking she had a roast in the oven or a sauce to check. Then she'd laugh to herself in the dark. "It's all right, Maggie," she'd murmur. "The pudding's long done." One evening in spring, Clara, her daughter, came to visit from Bath. It had been nearly a decade since Margaret had seen her. The meeting was shy at first, each studying the changes in the other's face. The years folded quietly between them. But as the evening went on, they fell into easy talk. Clara had inherited her mother's manner, composed, observant, but with a soft humour beneath the calm. "You used to frighten me, you know," Clara said teasingly as they shared tea. Margaret raised a brow. "Nonsense." "It's true," Clara insisted. "When you came home from service, you always smelled of smoke and spice and something important. You had this way of moving, like you were still in charge of the world. I thought the king himself must have feared you." Margaret laughed, a deep, warm sound. "No, love. Only the scullery girls did." Then, after a pause, she added more softly, "Though I suppose the kitchen was my little kingdom once. We all need a place to be the ruler of something." Clara reached across the table, laying her hand over her mother's. And now? Margaret looked at her hand, thinner now, the skin like fine linen. She smiled faintly. Now, I rule my kettle, my chair, and my memories, and that's more than enough. Even as the years deepened and her joints grew stubborn, Margaret Wicklow remained at the helm of the Haverly kitchen. She had become as much a fixture of the estate as the great oak doors or the ticking hall clock. Servants came and went, footmen replaced footmen, but cook stayed, her authority as enduring as the scent of spice in the air. The Fairchild children were grown now, scattered across London and the shires, but the house had not quieted. Lady Eleanor, a widow these 10 years, filled it with guests whenever her spirits dipped, which was often. Artists, vicars, idle cousins, and self-proclaimed intellectuals arrived in droves, all expecting elegant meals to match their conversations, and so the kitchen roared to life each season as if the world upstairs depended upon it. Margaret's mornings began before the first light touched the frost-dusted glass. She rose from her narrow cot in the servants' wing, slipped into her heavy gown, and tied her apron with the same firm tug she'd used since her 20s. The walk to the kitchen was short, but sacred. She liked to be the first to open the door, to breathe in the lingering ashes of the previous day's fire, the quiet before the clatter. Once the fire caught and the warmth began to bloom, the rest of the kitchen slowly awakened. The scullery maid stumbled in half asleep, followed by the kitchen boy with his basket of eggs. Then came Alice, no longer the trembling girl she had once been, but a steady-handed assistant with her hair tucked neatly beneath her cap. Margaret watched her with pride and a hint of relief, knowing she was being well shadowed by someone who understood the rhythm of the place. "Fetch the cream, dear," Margaret would say, her tone both command and kindness. "If it smells of the cow, it's too fresh for the table." Alice laughed every time, though she obeyed without question. The kitchen was never silent. It hummed like a living thing, the hiss of fat, the chop of knives, the murmur of boiling stock. To an untrained ear, it was chaos. To Margaret, it was music. She knew by sound alone whether the pastry would rise or the custard would curdle. When new servants joined the staff, they often marvelled at her sense of timing. She would lift her head from her work, sniff the air once, and say, "The sugar's catching," long before the smoke appeared. Even the butler, Mr. Renfield, who fancied himself the house's true authority, had learned not to cross her during dinner preparations. One memorable afternoon, he had wandered too close to the pastry board, inspecting the tarts with a self-satisfied air. Margaret had looked up, flour on her hands, and patience worn thin. "Mr. Renfield," she said mildly, "if you wish to eat your supper raw, you need only step into my kitchen again before the bell rings." He had not tested her since. For all her command, Margaret found comfort in her routines, the small human things that softened the weight of her position. She took her tea in the scullery at mid-morning, always the same chipped mug, always with a heel of bread and a dab of jam from her own preserves. She liked to read recipes during these quiet moments, though she rarely followed them to the letter. To her, a recipe was a suggestion, not a scripture. Sometimes the younger maids would gather around her stool, pretending to polish silver while they listened to her talk. They loved her stories, of kitchens in grander houses, of mistresses who swooned at the smell of burnt sugar, of guests who fainted when oysters turned in summer heat. Margaret never gossiped meanly, but her wit could slice finer than her carving knife. "Did you truly cook for a duke cook?" one girl asked once, her eyes wide. Margaret smiled over her teacup. "A duke, yes, and a stable full of donkeys, though I'll let you decide which was more trouble." The girls dissolved into laughter. The kitchen always seemed warmer after that. One cold evening, as a light snow drifted outside the basement windows, Lady Eleanor descended into the kitchen herself, a rare event. Wrapped in a shawl and followed by the faint scent of rosewater, she stood watching for a moment, uncertain of her footing on such foreign ground. "Cook," she began in that tone aristocrats use when they remember servants are human, "I've decided to host a dinner for Lord Holbridge next week. He's quite discerning. The finest table, the finest wine, something refined." Margaret continued rolling pastry, her expression unreadable. "Refined, my lady, or memorable?" Lady Eleanor blinked. "Is there a difference?" Margaret smiled faintly. pressing the dough into its tin. One fills the stomach, the other lingers. The lady hesitated, then nodded. Then let us have something that lingers, Mrs. Wicklow. When she left, the kitchen door closed with a soft click, and Margaret's lips curved into a slow, satisfied smile. She knew exactly what she would make. The week that followed was a whirlwind, not of panic, but of precision. A goose was hung and plucked, fruit soaked in brandy, sugar spun into delicate glass. Every corner of the kitchen glowed with purpose. Margaret worked steadily through it all, unhurried but unstoppable, her mind alive with the logistics of timing and texture. By the night of the dinner, Haverly House gleamed above like a stage, the laughter of the gentry rolling faintly through the floors. Below, the kitchen stood in perfect motion. The dishes emerged one after another, each bearing her invisible signature, and when the butler descended between courses, bearing word that Lady Eleanor's guests were enraptured beyond expression, Margaret only nodded once, her face calm. "Tell her ladyship that dinner will continue to improve so long as her guests don't," she said. The servants chuckled, and the kitchen moved on, as it always did, unseen, unthanked, but essential. The day always began with breakfast, though for the family upstairs it was more ceremony than sustenance. Margaret was often up hours before dawn, stoking the range until the black iron glowed, the air thick with the scent of coal and toast crumbs. She started with porridge, oats simmered low in milk until they turned creamy and thick enough to hold a spoon upright. She flavoured it with a shaving of nutmeg and a curl of butter that melted into gold on the surface. For Lady Eleanor she prepared something lighter, poached eggs with parsley, served on a delicate slice of toast baked the previous afternoon. The master, before he passed, had favoured cold beef slices and strong tea poured from a silver pot that hissed faintly when it met the porcelain. By 8:30, the house began to stir. The butler's footsteps echoed down the corridor. The housemaids rushed about with their dusters, and from the kitchen came the smell of frying bacon, not the thin, crisp kind, but thick, salty rashers that curled at the edges and left the air fragrant for hours. Fresh loaves were drawn from the oven, brown bread for the servants, fine white loaves for the family. Margaret oversaw every loaf herself, tapping each with her knuckle to hear the hollow sound of perfection. Butter was served cold from the larder, shaped into neat pats with grooved wooden paddles, and marmalade gleamed in its glass jar, glowing like amber in the morning light. When the upstairs bell rang, the trays went out, laden with dishes that gleamed in the candlelight. Sometimes Lady Eleanor took breakfast in her room, sometimes in the morning parlour, depending on her mood or the gossip she expected to receive. Either way, Margaret's work had to reach perfection unseen. The clatter of the trays returning was the kitchen's only applause. By midday, the kitchen began to hum again, luncheon preparations. It was the most unpredictable meal, for it depended entirely on the whims of the house. If guests were expected, it could resemble a miniature banquet. If not, a simple spread of cold meats and pies might suffice. Still, Margaret treated every dish with equal care. On one such day, when snow had gathered along the window ledges, she prepared a roast pheasant glazed with butter and lemon peel, the skin crisped to a deep chestnut sheen. The scent filled every corner of the kitchen, mingling with that of onions sizzling in dripping and the faint sweetness of apples stewing for tart filling. On the sideboard, she arranged cold collops of veal and a salad of cucumber sliced as thin as paper, dressed with vinegar and oil whisked by hand. The servants ate earlier, before the fine dishes went up. A thick stew of lentils, carrots, and beef bones that simmered quietly at the edge of the range. Margaret always made sure the servants' meal was hearty. "Empty bellies make clumsy hands," she'd often say, and the kitchen boys adored her for it. She had a genius for making use of scraps. Nothing went to waste under her watch. The rind of a ham might flavour a soup, the bones of a roast became the base for stock. Even the trimmings from pastry found new life in small tarts filled with jam or custard, which she sometimes set aside for the scullery girl when no one was looking. "To sweeten your scrubbing," she'd say, sliding the plate discreetly under a napkin. By 2 o'clock, luncheon was served upstairs, and the house fell briefly still. It was her favourite hour, that quiet intermission when she could finally sit by the range, sip tea brewed from leaves used once too often, and rest her hands on the table's warm wood. Then came dinner, the grandest production of all. The planning began days in advance. Menus written and rewritten, ingredients ordered from the market, spices measured by the ounce. Dinner at Haverly House was not merely a meal, it was a declaration of status. It demanded precision, spectacle, and grace, and Margaret was its invisible conductor. The evening began with soups, clear consommes or rich broths fortified with veal and herbs. On nights when Lady Eleanor wanted to impress, Margaret served turtle soup, its preparation a ritual of patience. The meat simmered for hours with Madeira, herbs, and a touch of lemon peel, then strained through muslin until it gleamed like amber. For the next course, she arranged fish, often turbot, served with egg sauce and a flourish of chopped parsley. Then came the roasts, goose with apples, mutton with mint jelly, or, on rarer nights, venison baked until the outer crust of fat melted like butter. Each dish required timing that bordered on artistry. Too long at the fire and the flesh toughened, too soon and the juices ran red onto the carving board. Margaret had no clocks in her kitchen. She judged by sight, sound, and instinct, the way the steam lifted, the weight of the carving knife, the whisper of fat spitting in the pan. For the side dishes, her creativity shone. She prepared forcemeat balls with thyme and sweet, carrots sliced into coins and glazed with sugar, and potatoes mashed so smooth they seemed to dissolve on the tongue. In summer, she served peas fresh from the kitchen garden. In winter, she coaxed warmth from pickled beets and baked parsnips. And always, she thought of balance. A heavy roast needed something bright beside it, something green, something that sang. Dessert was a realm of its own, syllabub whipped to a froth of cream and wine, moulded jellies that trembled delicately in candlelight, trifles layered with sponge, custard, and fruit. On special evenings, she made spun sugar, gossamer threads stretched and twisted into domes that glittered like frost over the puddings. The young footman often watched in awe as she drew the caramel into golden filaments with nothing but a fork and the surety of a magician. By the time the final dish left the kitchen, the range would be roaring, the copper pans gleaming with heat, and the floor dusted with a fine snow of flour. The air was thick with smells, roasted flesh, burnt sugar, wine, and bread. Margaret would wipe her brow, adjust her cap, and move to the pantry to oversee the last plates. Every motion was deliberate. Even the act of wiping a spill seemed ritualistic, as though she were tidying not merely her table but the very world around her. When the footman returned with the last of the dishes and the chatter of the upstairs dinner began to fade, the kitchen slowly unwound. The younger maids slumped at the table, laughing softly in their exhaustion. The scullery girl hummed as she scrubbed the final pans. Margaret sat with her teacup, too tired to drink it, watching the glow of the range settle into embers. Above her, the dining room's laughter continued, faint but constant, like the distant hum of another universe. She listened not with envy, but with a quiet pride, knowing that every word of praise uttered over the food began with her hands. No one would toast her name, but she didn't need them to. Her satisfaction lived in the warmth of the kitchen, in the gleam of the copper, in the perfection of a pudding that held its shape. And when the household finally sank into sleep, Margaret Wicklow remained a while longer, alone at her table. The scent of the night's feast lingered around her, rich, comforting, eternal. She breathed it in and smiled, knowing that tomorrow would begin again, just the same, with fire, flour, and the endless rhythm of the life she had made her own. The kitchen was more than a workplace, it was its own small village. Every day as the sun lifted itself over the frosted fields beyond Haverly House, the household below stairs began its quiet choreography. The sound of the pump clattering in the scullery mingled with the scraping of knives against boards, and Margaret Wicklow's voice, calm, deliberate, anchored the chaos. "Bread first," she'd say. "Everything good begins with bread." Flour dusted the air like morning mist as Alice and the kitchen boy began their work. They kneaded the dough under Margaret's watchful eye. White loaves for the family, coarser brown rounds for the servants' hall. She always judged the rise by touch alone, pressing her thumb lightly against the dough and smiling faintly when it pushed back, alive and ready. The loaves would bake in the great oven until the crusts turned golden, and the smell, rich, yeasty, a promise of comfort, reached every corner of the basement. For breakfast, Margaret kept the pace brisk. The Fairchilds favoured simple fare, but of the highest quality. Eggs gathered at dawn were boiled to varying times. 4 minutes for the lady, 6 for the guests who preferred firmness. Rashers of bacon crackled on the pan beside kidneys fried in butter with a hint of sage. A dish of grilled trout often appeared when the estate's lake was generous, served alongside warm rolls and marmalade gleaming like sunlit amber. For the servants, porridge simmered thick and hearty, stirred with a wooden spoon until it clung lovingly to the sides of the pot. She would ladle out bowls herself, ensuring every worker had their fill before the day began. Once the trays had gone upstairs and the kitchen quieted, the day's luncheon preparations began. Margaret never allowed idleness. Even in stillness, something was always steeping, cooling, or rising. On most days, she began with a soup, sometimes a clear mutton broth enriched with leeks and barley, other times a bright carrot soup sweetened with cream. In summer, she made cold dishes of sliced fowl or pressed tongue, garnished with watercress and hard-boiled eggs. In the colder months, pies reigned supreme, pigeon pie with rich brown gravy and flaky pastry tops, or minced veal and ham bound with nutmeg and cloves. She trained Alice in the art of seasoning, the subtle balance of acid, salt, and sweetness that defined her cooking. "Too much pepper," Margaret would say, "and a man tastes nothing else all day. Too little, and the tongue sleeps." The younger servants listened as though she were teaching scripture. Between the heavy work came small domestic comedies. The scullery girl, Bessie, had a habit of humming loudly when nervous, which drove the butler half mad whenever he came downstairs. The kitchen boy, Tom, idolized the footman and tried to mimic their speech, puffing his chest and saying, "Indeed, madam," to everyone, even the hens. Margaret found it all amusing, though she never let it show. "Talk less, Tom," she advised. "Your bread burns while your tongue struts." And yet, beneath her firmness, there was affection. When the boy burnt his hand on the copper pan, she dabbed it with cool butter and muttered, "Now you'll remember what impatience tastes like." By late afternoon, preparations for dinner began anew, and the kitchen transformed into something nearly theatrical. Copper pots gleamed on every surface, herbs hung drying from the beams, and the air was thick with the mingled perfumes of roasting meats, wine reductions, and fresh herbs. That evening the menu was ambitious: roast saddle of mutton with red currant jelly, a dish of baked salmon with anchovy sauce, and small artichoke hearts stewed in cream. For the first course, Margaret prepared a rich soup of celery and onion, blended smooth and finished with a swirl of thick cream. The servants moved around her like planets orbiting a calm sun. She did not shout, she didn't need to. A raised eyebrow from Margaret could stop a quarrel faster than any scolding. The dessert course was her quiet joy. She believed that sweetness softened the memory of all labour. That night, she created a lemon syllabub, wine and cream whipped together until they formed soft peaks, and a set of gooseberry tarts so glossy they seemed to glow. On the sideboard, she arranged candied orange peel and small squares of almond toffee for the gentlemen to nibble with their port. As the dinner hour drew near, the butler descended, clipboard in hand, his expression already tight with ceremony. "Her ladyship requires the dishes in 2 removes tonight," he said primly, "and prefers the roasts to arrive no later than the quarter hour after the second soup." Margaret only nodded. "The food," she said, "arrives when it's ready, not when the clock demands it." He blustered for a moment, then thought better of arguing. She was, after all, the only person in Haverly House who could make him tremble without raising her voice. As evening settled, the household above came to life. Carriages arriving, laughter spilling into the entry hall, the faint sound of a violin from the drawing-room. Below, the kitchen entered its finest hour. Flames roared, ladles clinked, and the sound of Margaret's footsteps moved steadily through it all. She basted the mutton with careful rhythm, spooning the hot fat over and over until the skin gleamed like mahogany. Nearby, Alice tended to a pot of sauce thickening with wine and shallots, while Bessie scurried about polishing silver platters until she could see her reflection. The aromas layered themselves: roasted meat, browned sugar, the citrus tang of lemons, and the clean bite of parsley. It was a symphony without audience, save for those who lived inside it. Margaret moved among her workers with quiet pride. "Careful now," she said, as Alice strained the sauce. "Too much haste, and you'll lose the shine. A proper sauce should coat the back of a spoon, not drown it." The platters went up in sequence: soup, fish, roast, pudding, sweets. Between courses, Margaret leaned briefly against the counter, feeling the faint tremor in her legs but refusing to sit. "Not yet," she whispered to herself, "the pudding's still proud." When the final dish left the kitchen, the staff finally exhaled. The glow of the range softened, and the room filled with the low murmur of voices, servants sharing laughter, secrets, and exhaustion. The air smelled of success, roasted fat, bread crust, and the faint sweetness of burnt sugar. Margaret poured herself a small glass of sherry, holding it up to the lamplight. "Tomorrow," she said softly, "we begin again." And she always did. The next morning dawned cold and pearly grey, the kind of light that turned the kitchen windows to silver and made the whole house seem hushed. But down below stairs, warmth was already blooming. Margaret Wicklow stood at the great table, her sleeves rolled high, a dusting of flour already on her forearms. It was baking day, the busiest and, to her mind, the most satisfying of all the household's rhythms. The air was alive with movement. Bessie, the scullery girl, fetched buckets of water from the pump, her boots squeaking against the stone floor. Alice had tied her apron tight and was rolling pastry with a steady, confident rhythm, while the kitchen boy Tom shuffled between larder and oven with baskets of sugar, raisins, and currants. Margaret, calm in the centre of it all, oversaw every motion like a conductor ensuring harmony. "Mind the flour, Alice," she said softly. "Too much, and the crust'll crack. Let it breathe." The morning's task began with bread, as always. The loaves for the week ahead required different hearts: rich manchet for the family, pale, tender, made from the finest bolted flour, and coarse brown loaves for the servants' hall, hearty enough to last through hard work. Margaret tested the yeast, dipping her finger in to feel the warmth. "Alive," she murmured with satisfaction as the faint fizz rose against her skin. The dough was worked by hand, its rhythm steady and sure, the table thumping softly as they kneaded. Soon the smell of baking drifted through the halls, warm and comforting, mingling with the faint salt of butter and the sweet ghost of currants. The housemaids upstairs would know by scent alone that it was baking day. Even Lady Eleanor sometimes descended with polite excuses to inspect the kitchen, though really it was the smell of warm bread that drew her. "Ah, cook," she would say, gloved hands clasped, "I do believe there is no finer perfume in all England than your ovens." Margaret would smile faintly, curtsying just enough to be proper. "It's a humble scent, my lady, but an honest one." After the loaves came the pastries and puddings. The first was a grand apple tart, layers of sliced fruit brushed with sugar and lemon peel, arranged in a perfect spiral that Margaret insisted must look fit to dance. She pricked the pastry with a fork, brushed it with cream, and slid it into the oven until the crust turned the colour of polished oak. Next came mince pies, for which she chopped suet, currants, raisins, and candied peel until the knife's rhythm filled the room like a lullaby. She flavoured the mixture with nutmeg, mace, and a little brandy, the scent of spice rising and clinging to her sleeves. "Every pie tells a story," she said quietly as she worked. "Too dry, and it's a miser's tale. Too sweet, and no one believes it." For the servants' table she prepared rice pudding, slow-baked in the corner of the range where the heat lingered low and patient. A pinch of cinnamon, a grating of lemon zest, and the scent filled the air like memory itself. When Tom peeked into the oven, Margaret wagged her spoon. "Patience, boy. A pudding's like good manners. It must settle before you show it off." By late morning, the kitchen was a kingdom of fragrance. Trays cooled on racks, buttered buns gleamed under muslin cloths, and jam jars stood ready to be filled. Today, she had planned a new batch of preserves: apricot and plum, their skins blanched, their flesh simmered with sugar until they shimmered like jewels. Margaret stirred the pot slowly, her spoon tracing lazy circles as the fruit broke down and the syrup thickened. Steam rose in golden waves, carrying the perfume of summer fruit through the winter air. Alice watched, entranced. "How do you know when it's ready, cook?" Margaret smiled. when the bubbles grow lazy, when the pot sighs instead of hisses. That's when the fruits told you its story. She ladled the jam into jars, each sealed with wax and tied with a neat muslin cover. The labels, written in her careful looping hand, read Plum Preserve, December 1819. These would be stored on the high pantry shelves, their colours glowing like jewels against the dim walls. In the long months ahead, when snow pressed against the windows and Lady Eleanor's guests longed for sweetness, it would be Margaret's jars that brought the taste of sunlight to their table. By the time the midday bell rang, the kitchen had cooled, but the work had not stopped. Lunch for the servants came first, thick slices of bread still warm from the oven, a stew of beef and barley simmered with onions, and wedges of apple tart for those who had earned it. The staff gathered at the long table, hands red from labour but spirits light. Laughter mixed with the clinking of spoons. Margaret ate last, as always, her meal modest. A small bowl of stew, a piece of bread, a quiet moment at the table's edge. From upstairs came the faint thump of the drawing-room piano, followed by the muffled voice of Lady Eleanor calling for tea. Once they've finished their chatter, Margaret said softly, rising, we'll begin their luncheon proper. The family's luncheon that day was light, cold pigeon pie, a salad of beetroot and onion, and custard tarts glazed with sugar until they shone. Each dish was carried upstairs on shining platters, and though Margaret would never see it, she imagined the moment Lady Eleanor's fork touched the crust and broke it cleanly in two. That sound, the crisp snap of perfection, was her truest reward. Down below, she turned to her assistants. Now, she said, tying her apron once more, let's prepare tomorrow's soup stock. The bones won't wait, and the rhythm continued, chopping, stirring, simmering, feeding the heart of the house that few ever saw but none could live without. Evening descended slowly over Haverly House, the last of the daylight fading into the grey-blue of the servants' courtyard. In the kitchen, however, the glow never dimmed. The range burned steady, its red heart pulsing against the brick, and the smell of roasted meat and toasted crumbs still clung to the air. It was the hour Margaret Wicklow liked best. When the plates from upstairs had returned, the household above stairs was lost in polite conversation or cards, and below stairs the family she had built for herself began to breathe freely again. The servants' supper was simple but comforting, a reward for the day's labour. Margaret had set aside thick slices of the brown bread baked that morning, a joint of mutton stewed slowly until it fell apart at the touch of a spoon, and bowls of carrots and turnips simmered in butter and pepper. For sweetness, she offered the broken apple tarts from the earlier batch, edges too imperfect for the family's table, but golden and fragrant all the same. The maids and footmen gathered around the long oak table, their laughter rising in waves between mouthfuls. Alice sat nearest the fire, cheeks flushed from its heat. She was telling a story about the gardener, a shy young man who had supposedly hidden a bouquet meant for her behind the tool shed, only for it to be discovered by the butler instead. The table erupted in laughter. Even Bessie, the scullery girl, dared to giggle, though she covered her mouth when Margaret looked over. "Mind you, he'll never grow flowers again if Mr. Renfield has his say," Margaret said dryly, ladling out another bowl of stew. Her wit, though mild, had an edge honed by decades of keeping order below stairs. After the meal, when most had drifted away to their duties or to their small corners of rest, Margaret remained with Alice and Tom to prepare for the next morning's breakfast. The rhythm of work soothed her, even in fatigue. 2 hams to boil for slicing, she said, checking her list. And the hens, make sure their eggs are gathered before the frost sets. The mistress fancies soft-boiled again. Alice nodded, wrapping the cooled loaves for the morning. Tom rubbed his eyes and yawned. "Don't think of your bed yet," Margaret warned gently. "The kitchen's never asleep, lad. It just dreams with its eyes open." He grinned, unsure whether it was a jest or a proverb. Once the others had gone to their bunks, Margaret stayed by the range, her candle flickering in the warm air. She set about planning the next day's dinner, a quiet ritual she never entrusted to anyone else. From a drawer she drew her worn notebook, its pages browned and smudged from years of use. Each dish was written in her careful hand: mock turtle soup, roast duck with orange, baked salmon, cherry pudding. She turned the pages, choosing the combinations like a composer selecting notes for a melody. For the next evening, She decided on a winter feast. Soup, a thick brown gravy soup made from veal bones and red wine, simmered all night on the back of the range. Fish course, haddock baked with cream and breadcrumbs, topped with parsley and lemon. Main roast, goose stuffed with apples, onions and sage, basted every half hour with dripping until the skin turned as crisp as lacquer. Side dishes, mashed turnips whipped with butter, a dish of stewed red cabbage with cloves, potatoes roasted in goose fat. Dessert, a baked plum pudding studded with currants, drenched in brandy and served flaming. She smiled faintly as she wrote, already picturing the rhythm of it all, the crackle of the fire, the rising heat, the ballet of serving dishes crossing her table. "It'll be a fine meal," she murmured to herself, "enough to make even the ghosts hungry." At that hour, the kitchen felt like a world apart from the grand house above. The air hummed softly with the low hiss of the range. The copper pans along the wall reflected the candlelight in warm blinks. From outside came the faint sound of wind over the stones, and farther still, the distant cry of an owl. Margaret sat for a while, letting her hands rest in her lap. The scent of flour and spice clung to her skin. Her palms were lined with years of kneading, chopping, stirring. To others, they might have looked rough and tired, but to her, they were her life's instruments, the tools that had kept the house fed and the world turning smoothly, one plate at a time. Before she rose, she reached for a small tin kept near the range. Inside was a single slice of seed cake, saved from the afternoon. She ate it slowly, savouring the simple sweetness, the tiny crunch of caraway that lingered on her tongue. It was not the food she made for others, but the kind she liked best, honest, warm, and without pretension. She banked the fire, laid out tomorrow's aprons, and blew out the candle. The kitchen fell into darkness, but the faint smell of sugar and smoke remained, clinging like a lullaby. Above stairs, the Fairchilds might sleep surrounded by velvet and silk, but below, Margaret's kingdom rested in quiet glory, awaiting the dawn. Before dawn had even brushed the sky with grey, Margaret Wicklow was awake again. The rest of Haverly House still slept, not a sound stirred above stairs, but below, the kitchen already breathed with faint warmth. The coals she had banked the night before glowed like buried rubies in the grate. She stirred them gently with the poker, coaxing flame to life, and the first light of the day flickered across the brass pots like sunrise caught in metal. The air was cool enough for her breath to show. She wrapped her shawl tighter and began the familiar ritual of morning. The great kitchen clock had not yet struck 5, but Margaret's sense of time was older than any mechanism. She moved by rhythm, not by hour, the quiet wisdom of someone who had lived half a century by the rise and fall of a flame. She began with breakfast preparations, the heartbeat of every day. The fire roared to life as she set the kettle upon it, the first hiss of steam sounding like a sigh of contentment. Beside it, she placed a large pot for boiling eggs. The family preferred theirs soft, trembling slightly in their shells, while the staff took them firmer, sliced onto toast. She laid out rashers of bacon, their fat pale and cool against the wooden board, and dusted them with a pinch of black pepper before laying them on the iron griddle to curl and crackle. The smell began its steady climb up through the floorboards, rousing even the sleepiest footman. Alice appeared next, still fastening her apron. "Good morning, cook," she murmured, rubbing her arms. "Morning, child," Margaret said. "Fetch the cream from the larder and be sure it's not turned. The mistress likes it thick for her tea." While Alice hurried off, Margaret set to work on the toast. Thick slices of yesterday's bread, browned on both sides and spread with butter so golden it shone. She always prepared a small tray herself for Lady Eleanor's breakfast. 2 eggs, toast, a spoonful of marmalade, and a pot of tea with milk warmed just so, not scalded, not cold. The precision of it mattered, even if no one upstairs ever noticed. By the time the household bell rang, the kitchen was alive. Bessie was sweeping cinders from the hearth, Tom was polishing the copper lids with a rag, and the footmen's voices echoed faintly as they came for the trays. Margaret directed them with practiced grace, barely lifting her voice. "Careful with that marmalade, James. It cost more than your wages," she said, half in jest, though he straightened immediately. Once breakfast had gone up, Margaret turned to the servants' table. There, she served steaming bowls of porridge swirled with treacle, thick slices of bread, and mugs of tea dark as ink. They ate quickly but contentedly, murmuring about the day's chores. Margaret took her own bowl standing, her spoon moving automatically while her eyes scanned the kitchen. She could sense what needed doing long before anyone spoke. Bessie, fetch more coal before the fire fades. Alice, once the washing up's done, we'll begin luncheon prep. And Tom, she paused as the boy stifled a yawn. If you must yawn, do it with purpose. It lets the morning in faster. That drew a ripple of laughter, even from herself. The luncheon for that day promised to be modest but delicate, a small party of visiting cousins, the Fairchild sisters from Bath. Margaret planned accordingly, a tureen of potato and leek soup, smooth as silk, its pale green hue brightened with a drizzle of cream. Cold roast chicken sliced thin and arranged with ribbons of lemon peel and parsley, a plate of cheese straws and freshly baked rolls, light enough to crumble at the touch. And for dessert, a set custard with nutmeg, baked in the small porcelain dishes reserved for family use. While Alice prepared the soup base, Margaret worked the dough for the rolls, her hands moving with a slow, hypnotic rhythm. The sound of kneading, soft thuds against the board, the sigh of the flour as it lifted, filled the air. Not too much salt, she reminded gently. Bread should be humble. Let the butter do the boasting. Bessie, meanwhile, was polishing the luncheon silver, the scullery light catching the gleam in brief bursts. She had grown bolder lately, humming quietly while she worked, a habit Margaret found oddly comforting. The hum wove itself into the kitchen soundscape like a bird call. When the soup began to simmer, the smell of leeks and butter spread through the air, clean and rich. Margaret leaned over the pot and stirred, listening to the quiet bubbling. "Good," she murmured. "It's talking." By midday, the first trays went upstairs. The soup gleamed pale green beneath the lid. The chicken rested on crisp lettuce leaves that glistened with oil. Margaret watched as the footmen departed, balancing the trays with their usual ceremony. For a brief moment, she felt the strange pride she always did, not boastful but deep and rooted. These were her creations, her invisible handwriting written in flavour instead of ink. Once the family dined, the servants gathered again for their own luncheon, the same soup, thicker and heartier, served with the day's leftover bread and wedges of cheese. Margaret made sure every bowl was full before she sat. She listened to the chatter, talk of the weather, of letters from home, of who had winked at whom in the village on Sunday. When the talk turned to gossip about Lady Eleanor's guests, Margaret simply raised an eyebrow. "If talk could boil soup, you'd save me the trouble," she said. The laughter that followed was warm and good-natured. After the meal, the kitchen settled into its quieter rhythm. Afternoon meant preparations for dinner, the most exacting work of all. She planned a menu for the evening that would showcase both elegance and comfort, the hallmark of her kitchen. First course, a clear consommé, delicate and golden, poured from a crystal jug into fine china bowls. Fish, fillets of sole rolled with a stuffing of herbs and breadcrumbs, served with white wine sauce. Roast, beef sirloin, basted until dark and shining, carved into tender slices and accompanied by Yorkshire pudding puffed high at the edges. Vegetables, buttered peas, glazed carrots, and a puree of celery root. Dessert, ratafia biscuits, a chocolate cream, and a moulded jelly set with slices of preserved orange suspended like jewels. The kitchen filled with sound and scent as evening neared. Butter melted in pans, wine hissed as it met the heat, knives chopped in rhythm. Margaret directed it all like a composer, never rushed, never unsure. The others followed her lead without question, drawn along by her certainty. When the jelly was finally unmoulded and the roast was resting, she took a moment to breathe. The smell of caramel, salt, and herbs filled her lungs like air from some better world. The work was endless, yes, but to Margaret Wicklow it was also endless purpose. By the time the last edge of daylight had slipped behind the hedgerows, Haverly House was stirring for its evening performance. The great hall above was already lit, chandeliers flaring, candles doubling in the mirrors, and from the music room came the faint, elegant sweep of a violin tuning up. Below stairs, the kitchen was a different kind of symphony, metal and fire and breath. Margaret Wicklow stood in the centre of it, apron neatly folded at the waist, hair tucked under her white cap. Around her, the staff moved in well-rehearsed motion. The air smelled of searing meat, wine, and warm bread, the language of her life. Tonight was no ordinary supper. Lady Eleanor was entertaining her sisters from Bath and 2 guests of consequence, a baronet and his wife. It meant showmanship, not excess, but the quiet, confident mastery for which Haverly House had become known. The first course began with a clear consommé, translucent as amber and shimmering in the lamplight. It had been made the day before, veal bones roasted, simmered for hours with onion, carrot, and a bundle of herbs, then strained through muslin until it could catch the light like glass. A touch of sherry deepened its perfume. Margaret tasted it once before sending it up, her spoon gliding across the surface. "Smooth as truth," she murmured approvingly. Alongside the soup went delicate pastry shells filled with oysters, the filling rich with cream and a hint of cayenne. The smell alone was enough to make the kitchen pause, that blend of salt and butter, sea and hearth. Bessie stood transfixed for a moment, holding her tray in awe. "Off you go, girl," Margaret said, smiling. "They'll be cold before the compliments reach us." The fish course followed swiftly. Rolled fillets of sole, stuffed with parsley, lemon zest, and a whisper of nutmeg. The rolls were poached gently in wine and laid on a bed of spinach, the sauce thickened to silk with butter. When the lids went on, steam rose like incense. The kitchen glowed golden in its haze, every copper pan catching the firelight. Then came the roast, the heart of the meal, a sirloin of beef, basted in its own juices until the outer crust gleamed dark as lacquer. The scent filled every breath. Even the stone walls seemed to absorb it. Margaret oversaw the carving herself, slicing the beef into ribbons that glistened ruby at the centre. Around it, she arranged Yorkshire puddings, puffed and proud, each browned to perfection. On separate platters, she sent up her side dishes, small triumphs in their own right, glazed carrots that shone like polished amber, peas in butter, bright green and freckled with mint, celery root puree, pale and fragrant, shaped into small domes, roasted potatoes tossed in parsley and salt. And for those who craved something tart against the richness, a sauce of red currant and wine gleamed in a silver bowl. Once the plates for the main course had gone, the kitchen's roar softened. For a few minutes there was stillness, the hush between waves. Margaret wiped her hands on a towel, feeling the heat rise from the range like a living thing. "Good work," she said quietly. The younger servants grinned, cheeks flushed with pride. But the evening was not yet done. Dessert was to be the grand flourish, her unspoken signature. She began assembling it while the others cleared the roasting trays. The dessert table held a procession of marvels, a moulded orange jelly, its clear body catching the candlelight, with slices of preserved peel suspended inside like golden glass. Chocolate cream served in silver cups, dark and glossy, topped with curls of sugared almond. Ratafia biscuits, small, crisp, and perfumed with bitter almond, stacked in a perfect pyramid. And at the centre, her pride, a flaming plum pudding, dense with currants, raisins, and candied peel, soaked in brandy and ignited just before service. The blue flame danced across its surface like moonlight on coal. When the butler descended for it, his usual stiffness had melted into awe. "Cook," he said quietly. "The house smells fit for Christmas itself." Margaret allowed herself the smallest smile. "Then take Christmas upstairs before it cools." The kitchen exhaled when the last dish left its hearth. The range was streaked with soot, the air hazed with the sweetness of sugar and smoke, but the work was done, or at least the visible part of it. The younger staff collapsed into chairs, their laughter rising in exhausted bursts. Alice leaned back, fanning herself with a cloth. "Do you ever tire of it, cook?" she asked, half amused, half awed. The endless dinners, the fires, the waiting. Margaret stirred her cup of tea, watching the ripples darken. "No," she said after a pause, "because every night it ends with silence, and that's the sweetest course of all." Outside the snow had begun to fall, faint and steady against the panes. The servants' supper was laid, mutton stew thick with barley, fresh bread from that morning, and the last of the apple tarts. They ate quietly, the glow of the fire softening their faces. Margaret joined them only for a moment, tasting the stew to be sure it was seasoned right. When she finally sat back, the house above was still echoing with laughter, but down here, it was peace, the kind that smells of flour and wood smoke and the last bit of warmth before sleep. The dinner hour passed, the music upstairs waned, and Haverly House settled into the blue hush that always followed its grandest evenings. The laughter of the guests, once bright as bells, drifted away through the ceiling timbers. In the kitchen below, the last act of the night began, the quiet, unglamorous ballet of clean-up. The range still glowed, its embers pulsing faintly under a thin veil of ash. Steam rose from the scullery, where Bessie bent over the great sink, her sleeves rolled to the elbows. The clatter of dishes echoed softly, muted by the damp air. Margaret Wicklow, candle in hand, moved slowly through the space, inspecting the aftermath with the careful eye of a general surveying a battlefield after victory. Every surface told the story of the evening, crumbs scattered like confetti, streaks of gravy gone cold on silver trays, the sweet scent of burnt sugar lingering from the pudding's blue flame. Margaret ran a cloth along the table, sweeping the remnants into her palm. She never liked leaving disorder overnight. A kitchen, she often said, should rest as neatly as a made bed. "Mind the china, Alice," she said gently, as the younger woman stacked plates onto the drying rack. "Those are her ladyship's dessert service. One chip, and she'll weep like a widow." Alice nodded, careful but smiling. "I'd sooner chip my own head cook." "Some days you do," Margaret said dryly, but her eyes softened as she spoke. The staff had begun to fade from exhaustion. Tom had fallen asleep at his stool by the fire, his cap slipping over one eye, the faintest trace of soot across his nose. Bessie, still humming, scrubbed the last pot with a rag almost bigger than she was. When she stopped to yawn, Margaret took the cloth gently from her hand. "That's enough, child. The pots will keep till morning. You'll work better for sleeping." Bessie hesitated. "You'll stay up, won't you, cook?" "Aye," Margaret said. "A kitchen's like a hearth. Someone must watch it till the coals go quiet." She gave each of them a kind word as they drifted off toward the servants' quarters. A rare kindness she never announced, but that everyone remembered. When she was alone again, the silence filled the room like breath returning after a long-held note. Margaret poured herself a cup of weak tea from the pot that had sat too long, its surface now pale with cooling cream. She didn't mind. She drank it slowly, watching the shadows dance against the stone walls. From above, she could hear the faintest murmur, chairs scraping, the muffled tread of footmen clearing plates, laughter softened by distance. The life upstairs and the life below, always parallel, never meeting. She drew her stool near the fire and took up a small knife and bowl. The next day's morning preparations would wait for no one, and she liked to start early. With practiced ease, she began slicing the cured ham for breakfast, thin, almost translucent strips that caught the candlelight like silk. The scent of salt and smoke filled the air again, blending with the faint sweetness of the dying pudding. On the counter nearby rested a small basket of lemons, their skin bright against the dim. She rolled one under her palm, feeling the oil release beneath the rind. Tomorrow, she thought, she would make lemon curd for the mistress's toast. Eggs, sugar, butter, lemon zest, stirred in a copper pan until thick as velvet. She smiled faintly at the thought, knowing Lady Eleanor would never ask who made it. After a time, she rose to check the larder. The cold air hit her face like a tide, crisp and damp. Rows of shelves gleamed with order, jars of plum preserves, bundles of herbs tied with string, crockery sealed with wax. The roasted bones for tomorrow's soup were already set aside, their fat cooling in the pan. Everything was ready, everything had its place. As she turned back toward the warmth, she paused by the narrow window above the stairs. Outside, the courtyard was silvered with frost. The moon hung low, pale and round, and the only sound was the faint rattle of branches. For a moment, Margaret stood there, one hand on the stone sill, and breathed deeply, the mingled scents of her kingdom: smoke, salt, citrus, bread. The house above might sleep in silk and feather pillows, but below stairs the comfort was simpler, the satisfaction of work done well, of hunger met and tamed. She felt the ache in her feet, the weight in her hands, and welcomed both. When she returned to the kitchen, the fire had burned low, reduced to a handful of glowing embers. She crouched, fed it one last scoop of coal, and watched as the orange light flared up to kiss the underside of the kettle. The warmth wrapped around her like an old shawl. From the corner, the clock chimed midnight. Slow, patient, almost kind. Margaret Wicklow folded her apron, set it neatly beside her cap, and sat once more before the fire. The last of the tea had gone cold, but the silence was rich, companionable. The kitchen slept now, but its heartbeat, the faint hiss of the fire, the drip from the sink, the sigh of the cooling metal, continued beneath her steady breathing. And there she remained, queen of her quiet world, watching the coals fade one by one, already thinking of the next morning's bread. Morning came softly to Haverly House, wrapped in mist and the faint smell of chimney smoke. The frost that had silvered the courtyard overnight still clung to the stones, but below stairs the kitchen was already alive with the glow of the rekindled fire. Margaret Wicklow had not needed the clock to wake her. Her body, trained by 40 years of duty, knew the moment before dawn as intimately as breathing. She tied her apron, smoothed her hair beneath her cap, and lit a second candle. The others would come soon enough, but she always liked a few minutes of solitude first. It was her favourite time, the hour when the world was quiet, when the kitchen felt like a private chapel, the air thick with promise instead of noise. She filled the kettle, listening to the water echo faintly in the stillness, then set it on the iron grate to heat. Before long, the range began to hum its steady song. Margaret laid out the boards for breakfast. Ham sliced thin from the joint she'd trimmed last night, rashers of bacon, fresh eggs from the hens, and a jug of milk brought in before dawn. The smell of smoke, salt, and warmth filled the air. She sliced bread into thick slabs, spreading butter so yellow it looked almost gilded in the candlelight. By the time Alice entered, rubbing her arms, hair still damp from washing, the kitchen had already taken on its comforting rhythm. "Good morning, cook," she said, voice still thick with sleep. "Morning, dear," Margaret replied. "The ham's ready for slicing and the eggs for boiling. I trust you remember how long for soft?" 4 minutes exactly. Margaret smiled faintly. "Good. The lady likes them to tremble, not weep." Alice laughed and went to her task, her movements sure and careful. Margaret watched from the corner of her eye, not to correct, but to measure. She saw, with quiet satisfaction, that the girl no longer hesitated before lifting a pan or setting a timer in her mind. The kitchen's rhythm was settling into her bones. Soon the others trickled in, Bessie clattering with buckets, Tom stumbling in half awake, the footmen stamping the frost from their boots as they came for trays. The scent of frying bacon reached upward through the floorboards, announcing breakfast to the sleeping house. Margaret oversaw every tray, eggs gleaming, toast cut neatly, the marmalade glistening under its glass lid. For Lady Eleanor, she added a small dish of lemon curd, freshly made that morning, tart and smooth, and a sprig of mint beside it, a touch she would likely never notice but that Margaret could not resist adding. When the trays departed, the kitchen turned its attention to the servants' meal. Porridge thickened with milk and sweetened with treacle, accompanied by the smaller heel of yesterday's bread. Margaret made sure Bessie's bowl was full before her own. "Eat while it's hot," she said. "No sense working on an empty stomach. Hunger makes fools of us all." Bessie nodded, grateful, and tucked in. Once breakfast had gone up, Margaret began planning the baking for the day. She consulted her battered recipe book, the pages wrinkled with time. Today was to be a full day of ovens, new loaves for the larder, tarts for luncheon, and small seed cakes for the family's afternoon tea. She began with the dough, measuring the flour by feel, a scoop here, a handful there, enough to feed both family and staff. "The trick," she told Alice as they worked side by side, "is not to command the dough. You coax it." Alice pressed her fingers into the soft mass. "Like a child?" Margaret nodded. A well-behaved one. The air grew thick with the perfume of yeast and butter as the loaves began to rise. On the side table she set out bowls for apple turnovers, each filled with sliced fruit, sugar, and a dusting of cinnamon. Their smell, once baked, would fill the corridors, the kind of scent even the upstairs maids whispered about. "See the edges, Alice," she said, folding one pastry over another. A neat crimp holds more than fruit. It holds your reputation. Alice laughed, blushing. Yes, cook. By mid-morning the ovens were busy, the air shimmering with heat. The loaves swelled and cracked along their tops, steam rising like halos as they baked. Bessie moved from tray to tray, brushing butter across the crusts, while Tom whisked eggs for the next round of cakes. Margaret's eyes missed nothing. A burnt corner, a crooked row, a pan that hissed too sharply. She corrected each with a calm word or a single raised brow. When the tarts were cooled and the loaves stacked neatly on the shelf, she finally allowed herself a cup of tea. She sat near the range, watching the soft shadows play across the tiles. Alice joined her, wiping her hands on her apron. "Cook," she said hesitantly, "when you retire one day, will they bring someone down from London to replace you?" Margaret gave a small smile. "Perhaps, but I expect she'll ask you how to light the ovens properly before a week's gone by." Alice looked down, embarrassed but pleased. "I hope I'll make you proud." "You already do," said Margaret. "You listen, and that's rarer than talent." The kitchen's peace lasted until the sound of the upstairs bell broke it, a sharp metallic ring that sent every heart below stairs into motion. "Ah," said Margaret, standing. "The mistress is awake and wants her chocolate." She moved to the small stove by the wall, pouring milk into a copper pan. Into it she shaved dark chocolate, stirring until the liquid thickened to velvet. The scent of cocoa filled the room, warm and rich. She poured it into a porcelain jug and added a whisper of cinnamon, Lady Eleanor's indulgence. As the footman took the tray upstairs, Margaret wiped her hands and turned back to her table. "All right," she said to her little kingdom. "No rest for the righteous." Luncheon waits for no one. The kitchen stirred again. Knives lifted, ovens opened, fire brightened. The day began anew, a seamless rhythm of hunger and satisfaction. And at its centre, as steady as the tick of the old clock on the wall, stood Margaret Wicklow, the heartbeat of Haverly House, her apron dusted in flour and her world perfectly in order. By midday the rhythm of Haverly House had quickened again. Above stairs the drawing-room bell chimed. Below, the air in the kitchen shimmered with heat and noise. Margaret Wicklow stood by the oak table, sleeves rolled high, her spectacles perched low on her nose as she reviewed the day's luncheon list. Lady Eleanor's sisters were still in residence, and that meant something genteel but plentiful, a meal that would impress without vulgar show. The first course was already underway, a soup of green peas and lettuce, smooth and fragrant. Alice worked the ladle in slow circles while Margaret added a final handful of fresh mint, torn gently by hand so the oils would bloom into the broth. "That's enough stirring, dear. Let the peas rest, or you'll break their spirits," she said, with that half-mocking tenderness her staff had come to adore. The soup would be served with tiny triangles of buttered toast sprinkled with grated cheese, delicate, crisp, and just enough to make the guests murmur their approval. On the far side of the kitchen boy Tom was plucking a brace of partridges, feathers sticking to his sleeves. The faint metallic smell of the birds mixed with the sweeter perfume of baking pastry, creating the strange alchemy that marked every Georgian kitchen. "Not too rough, lad," Margaret called over. "We're feeding ladies, not wolves. If you tear the skin, it won't roast pretty." Tom grinned sheepishly, his face red from effort. The birds would be roasted later with butter, lemon, and a dusting of flour, then served cold with cress and mustard for the luncheon table, a dish both refined and refreshing. Beside him, Bessie rolled out the pastry for a vegetable pie, her small hands working steadily. The filling, a rich mix of carrots, turnips, and leeks, had been stewed earlier in cream and nutmeg. Margaret bent over to test the seasoning, then nodded. "Simple," she said, "but simplicity, done right, makes a house sound prosperous." The second course required more precision. From the larder came cold salmon, glistening faintly, to be served with cucumber slices laid in careful concentric rings and a sauce of butter, vinegar, and herbs. The colour alone, pink, green, and pale gold, pleased Margaret's eye. She had an artist's instinct for balance, though she would never have called it that. On the sideboard, a pudding was being prepared, a baked custard with a crust of caramelized sugar, smooth enough to quiver at the spoon. Alice hovered over it anxiously. "Don't fuss it to death," said Margaret. "Let the fire do the thinking. It knows its business better than any of us." She moved then to the small table by the window, where the bread for the family rested under a linen cloth. She lifted the corner, checked the colour, and smiled faintly. Good. Bread's risen proud today. Must have liked the music upstairs. As the clock struck 1, the footman appeared for the trays. The soup first, that soft green perfume filling the air, followed by the salmon gleaming like polished marble. Behind them went the partridges, golden brown and fragrant, and finally the vegetable pie with its buttery crust. Dessert would be sent up later. Small dishes of gooseberry fool, whipped cream folded through stewed fruit, cool and pale against the heat of the afternoon. Once the doors closed and the sound of their steps faded, a sigh went through the kitchen. The hardest part was done. Margaret poured herself a cup of tea, the strong kind she liked, and leaned a hip against the table. The younger servants gathered for their own midday meal. They ate a simpler version of what had gone upstairs. The same soup, but heartier, thickened with barley, bread still warm from the oven, a plate of leftover vegetables stewed with beef bones. The laughter came easily now. Bessie, wiping her hands, began whispering to Alice about the gardener again, how he'd left another bunch of flowers by the kitchen door that morning, this time tied with a ribbon. "He swears he only came down for the compost," Bessie giggled. Tom rolled his eyes. "A man doesn't risk the butler's wrath for compost." Margaret raised one eyebrow, her teacup poised mid-air. "He'll risk worse if he tramples my herb beds again." The room broke into laughter, the kind that filled the air like a blessing. Margaret didn't laugh aloud, she rarely did, but her lips curved, and she let the warmth of it settle around her. After they'd eaten, she rose and set her cup aside. "Right then," she said. "There's the soup bones to boil for tonight's stock, and the cream to whip for dessert. The world doesn't stop because the gentry are napping." She opened the pantry door and stepped into the cooler air, her fingers brushing the rows of jars. Plums preserved in syrup, apricots glowing in glass, currants dried and waiting for winter puddings. Each one represented hours of work, yet she felt no fatigue as she inventoried them. The work sustained her as much as it wearied her. Returning to the kitchen, she called softly, "Alice, fetch me the brandy from the shelf. We'll flavour the fool proper this time. The ladies from Bath can stand a bit of courage." Alice brought it, eyes wide with amusement, and together they stirred the dessert, the rich aroma of fruit and spirits filling the room. When it was done, Margaret tasted it once, nodded and said, "That'll bring smiles enough to light a table." Outside, the first pale hints of afternoon sun reached through the high windows, turning the floating flour dust into gold. The kitchen's fire hissed, the clock ticked on, and life below stairs continued in its endless comforting rhythm, an unseen masterpiece performed 3 times a day, every day, for as long as Margaret Wicklow ruled her realm. By late afternoon, the sun had begun its slow descent behind the high hedgerows of Haverly House, sending warm ribbons of gold through the kitchen windows. Dust and flour floated in the light like tiny dancers. The noise upstairs had softened. The Fairchild ladies were at their embroidery and tea, but below, the heartbeat of the house quickened once again. Margaret Wicklow stood before the range, spoon in hand, her brow faintly damp from the heat. She had spent more than 4 decades in kitchens, and yet the moments before dinner always brought a hush of anticipation. This was the true test of a household, the meal that carried its reputation beyond the hedges and into gossiping parlours. She reviewed her plan, lips moving silently as she counted off each dish. Tonight, she had chosen a menu of quiet elegance, satisfying, seasonal, and full of contrasts that made her proud to be English. The first course would be a broth of mutton and root vegetables, slow-simmered all afternoon in a deep pot. The smell was rich and earthy, carrots, parsnips, celery, a touch of pearl barley for body. She leaned over it now, stirring gently, and tasted with the edge of a wooden spoon. The flavour had depth, patience, it tasted of the hearth itself. "Perfect," she said under her breath, then called across the room, "Alice, ladle it off the bone and skim it clean. A good broth should be clear enough to see your fortune in." Alice obeyed, steady-handed, her motions smooth. She had grown confident these past months. Even Margaret noticed how the girl's shoulders squared now when she worked. For the fish course, the kitchen boy Tom had fetched fine river trout that morning, caught in the estate's pond. The fish gleamed silver pink, fresh as sunrise. Margaret seasoned them lightly, salt, pepper, and a scattering of chopped herbs, then wrapped each in paper with a sliver of butter before baking them on the hearth. The heat sealed the juices inside. When she unwrapped the first, steam billowed upward, carrying a scent both clean and buttery. "See that?" she said to Bessie, who was wide-eyed beside her. "That's what the gentry call refinement, a fish that tastes like it still remembers the water." The girl giggled, wiping her hands. The main course demanded most of the kitchen's energy. Margaret had chosen roast duck with spiced apples, a dish as theatrical as it was fragrant. The ducks, plump and well-fed, were basted repeatedly until their skin turned the colour of burnished mahogany. On the side table, Alice stewed the apples in butter, brown sugar, and cloves until they softened into gleaming golden slices. When the ducks were carved, the apples would be spooned alongside, their sweetness cutting the richness of the meat. To accompany it, she prepared a ragout of mushrooms and onions, cooked slowly with a little Madeira wine until dark and glossy. The scent filled every corner of the room, making even the servants' stomachs twist with hunger. "Mind the mushrooms," she told Alice. "Too much wine, and you'll have sauce fit for a tavern instead of a table." "Yes, cook." The vegetables were simpler, but no less beautiful. Asparagus tips in melted butter, their green bright against the copper pans. Mashed turnips, pale and smooth, touched with nutmeg, and tiny carrots glazed with honey, gleaming like jewels under the lamplight. While the roasts turned and the sauces thickened, the dessert took shape. Margaret oversaw a lemon cream pudding, pale yellow and scented faintly of zest, its surface smooth as porcelain. Around it, she arranged dishes of baked pears in syrup, each one glistening like amber. "Cook," said Bessie, watching the syrup drip from the spoon. "How do you know when the fruit's done?" Margaret smiled faintly. "When it looks like it could tell you a secret and you'd believe it." The girl laughed, the sound small and warm in the heavy air. As the sky dimmed, candles were lit along the kitchen wall, their flames trembling in the faint draughts. The clock struck 6, and the footmen appeared in their livery, crisp and polished, ready for service. The sequence began: soup, fish, roast, sweets. Each dish went out in solemn procession, gleaming beneath its silver lid. Margaret oversaw every moment like a captain steering through fog, calm even as heat shimmered off the walls. "Mind your pace," she warned one footman as he hesitated near the door. "A wobbled pudding ruins reputations." When the door closed behind the last tray, the kitchen let out a breath, the tension unravelling into laughter. Bessie slumped into a chair, Alice fanned herself with her apron, and Tom, always the boldest, said, "Cook, if heaven smells half as fine as this kitchen, I'll mend my ways this very night." Margaret chuckled quietly, her hands resting on the table. "Then let's hope heaven's range burns as steady." The servants' supper came next, made from the remnants of glory: duck bones stripped of meat, mashed turnips, thick slices of bread soaked in gravy. The stew was humble but rich, and they devoured it eagerly, trading gossip between spoonfuls. Bessie whispered to Alice about a letter the butler had received, perhaps from a lady, perhaps from his tailor. Tom made faces behind her back, earning a smothered laugh. The warmth of the food, the glow of the fire, the soft fatigue in their limbs, it all wrapped around them like a shared dream. Margaret sat apart, sipping tea that had gone cold. She listened but didn't interrupt. She liked their chatter. It made the place feel alive, a heartbeat continuing long after the gentry had withdrawn to their parlours. Every joke, every sigh, every shared meal kept the house human. Later, when the trays returned empty and the laughter upstairs faded, she stood again by the range. The duck bones would be boiled for stock tomorrow. The leftover apples would find their way into hand pies for breakfast. Nothing wasted, nothing lost. That was her creed. She leaned one hand on the warm brick, feeling the faint tremor of the fire beneath. It was always the same: exhaustion wrapped in satisfaction, the sweet ache of a day well spent. The others would go soon, leaving her alone with her quiet, breathing kitchen. She smiled, faint and content, as she turned toward the table. "Tomorrow," she said softly, We'll make pigeon pie." The next morning dawned pale and still, the mist lying thick over the fields beyond Haverly House. From the upstairs windows, the gardens were little more than a blur of white, but below stairs the kitchen glowed golden. The range had been lit before 5, and Margaret Wicklow stood at her post wrapped in her shawl, a wooden spoon in hand. The coals hissed softly as she added another scoop, coaxing the heat higher. It was a baking and roasting day, and her mind was already mapping the hours ahead. "We'll start with the pigeons," she said to Alice, who was rubbing sleep from her eyes. "They've been hung just long enough. Fetch them from the cold larder, careful not to bruise the breasts." Alice obeyed, vanishing into the chill of the pantry and returning with a tray of small plump birds, their feathers plucked, their skin pale against the pewter. Margaret ran her hand across them, nodding with approval. "Good weight. They'll roast beautifully." The pigeon pies were to be the centerpiece of luncheon, hearty, fragrant, and perfectly respectable for a household that prided itself on old-fashioned abundance. Margaret began the filling first, minced pigeon meat browned in butter, joined by mushrooms, onions, and a small splash of claret. The smell filled the kitchen almost immediately, rich and savoury, the air thick with warmth and promise. She stirred slowly, her wrist steady despite the heat. "A pie should smell like comfort before it even reaches the table," she said. "If it doesn't make the footman hungry, you've done something wrong." Bessie, wide-eyed beside her, sprinkled flour into the pan to thicken the sauce. "Will the claret make it too strong, cook?" Margaret shook her head. "Not if you've got a patient hand. Let it whisper, not shout." While the filling simmered, Alice prepared the pastry, rolling it thin, cutting neat circles, and lining the pie dishes with careful precision. Margaret moved between them, her hand occasionally guiding a rolling pin or adjusting the dusting of flour. "That's it, steady. A good crust's like a promise. It should never break without reason." By the time the clock struck 8, the pies were in the oven, and the kitchen smelled heavenly. Roasted pigeon, buttery pastry, and the faint sweetness of wine blending in the air. The breakfast fire was already lit for the household above, and Margaret turned her attention there. The family breakfast that morning would be light: tea, soft-boiled eggs, thin toast, and cold ham. But the servants' breakfast, as always, was humbler and heartier. Porridge, bread spread with dripping, and tea as dark as treacle. Tom, the kitchen boy, yawned as he carried in the milk from the yard, his breath visible in the cold air. "Careful there, lad," said Margaret, taking the jug from him. "If you spill it, we'll have to milk the cow ourselves, and she's got no manners before noon." He grinned. "You'd charm her, cook." She gave him a look sharp enough to cut pastry. "I charm ovens, not livestock." Once the trays for upstairs had gone out, gleaming, orderly, and bearing the smell of comfort, the kitchen turned wholly to the business of luncheon. The pigeons emerged from the oven in perfect procession, their crusts puffed and golden, each one bearing a tiny hole in the top where the steam had sighed its escape. The aroma drew even the footman down early, hovering under the pretense of polishing silver. "Don't stand about like chimney ornaments," Margaret scolded mildly. "If you're hungry, there's porridge. These pies aren't for you, not till tomorrow." They grinned sheepishly and retreated, though the scent followed them like a ghost. The luncheon's side dishes were already in motion: carrots in butter, mashed potatoes whipped with cream, and a salad of celery and apple dressed with lemon. For the second course, Margaret had planned something lighter: a baked cod with herbs, its surface dusted with breadcrumbs and parsley, served with a sauce of butter and lemon juice. "Simple dishes," she said to Alice, "but never plain. Plain food is lazy food." Alice nodded, repeating the phrase quietly as she worked, as though committing scripture to memory. When the first trays went upstairs, the kitchen exhaled. The pies had turned out perfectly, crusts browned just so, their interiors rich and tender. Margaret cut one open to test the filling before sending the rest up, and steam poured out like a sigh. The smell of wine, meat, and butter mingled in the air until even she felt her stomach stir. She allowed herself a small sliver, tasting with the precision of a judge. The flavours were balanced, deep: the salt of the meat, the sweetness of the claret, the faint tang of the herbs. She closed her eyes for a moment. "Yes," she whispered, "that's right." Bessie clapped softly from the corner. "Cook, It's the best yet. Margaret smiled but waved her off. It's never the best yet, girl. There's always another pie to make. The rest of the afternoon passed in a gentle hum. The servants' meal came next, stew made from the leftover pigeon trimmings, thickened with barley and carrots, followed by the heel of one of the breakfast loaves, spread with honey. They ate around the long table, sleeves rolled up, cheeks flushed with heat and contentment. Tom told a ridiculous story about a delivery boy who had tried to flirt with the parlour maid and tripped over his own crate. Even Margaret laughed, softly and unwillingly. The sound was rare and precious, enough to make Bessie beam with pride. When the dishes were cleared, Margaret began the early stages of dinner preparation, checking the stock that simmered on the back of the range, cleaning the ducks for roasting, and setting out the sugar moulds for the evening's desserts. The rhythm of it soothed her like prayer. Alice lingered beside her, polishing the rolling pin. "Cook," she said hesitantly, "do you ever wish you'd done something else? Anything other than cooking?" Margaret paused, looking into the fire where the coals glowed low and steady. "No," she said at last. "Cooking's never just cooking, child. It's tending life itself. You feed people, and they go on living. That's more power than any lady has in her ballroom." Alice didn't speak. She only smiled, and the sound of the range filled the silence between them like music. The light faded early that evening, pulling the world above stairs into candlelit quiet. From the open windows of the drawing room, one could hear the faint strains of a harpsichord and the polite murmur of conversation, the gentry gliding through their evening ritual. But below stairs, the heart of Haverly House was in full roar again. The kitchen pulsed with energy. The heat from the range shimmered against the tiled walls, and the scent of roasting meat mingled with butter, wine, and spice. Copper pans gleamed in the lamplight like polished suns. Margaret Wicklow stood in the centre of it all, spoon in hand, every movement purposeful. Tonight's dinner was to be finer than most. Lady Eleanor's guests had doubled, and she had requested something grand but not French, which, to Margaret's mind, was an invitation to show what an English kitchen could do at its very best. The first course was nearly ready by 6. Clear chicken broth with small dumplings of forcemeat and herbs, simmered just until tender. The aroma was gentle but welcoming, the kind of scent that made conversation soften when the lids were lifted. To accompany the soup, Margaret had prepared buttered toasts topped with anchovy paste, rich and sharp, a favourite of the Fairchild sisters. The paste had been beaten earlier that afternoon, anchovies pounded with butter, lemon and a dash of pepper until smooth as cream. As she arranged the small toasts on the platter, she spoke quietly to Alice beside her. "There's a rhythm to a meal, you see. It should rise and fall like breathing, start softly, end sweetly." Alice nodded, watching the steam coil from the bowls. "Like music, cook." "Exactly," said Margaret, smiling faintly. "Only we make ours with knives and fire." The fish course followed soon after. Baked haddock with oysters laid neatly in a dish and covered with a sauce of wine and cream. The oysters had been opened only minutes before, glistening like pearls on the counter. Margaret supervised their layering herself. Fish, oysters, sauce, breadcrumbs, a sprinkle of nutmeg. It baked until the top turned golden and the edges bubbled. When she opened the oven door, a wave of fragrance rolled out. The salt of the sea wrapped in butter and warmth. "If that doesn't make them forget the weather," she murmured, "nothing will." Next came the roast, the true centerpiece, a haunch of venison, slow roasted for hours, basted in its own juices mixed with port and crushed juniper. The skin was glossy and dark, the air around it heavy with the perfume of wine and smoke. She carved a slice to test the doneness, and the knife slipped through like silk. The meat was perfectly pink inside. "Now that," said Margaret quietly, "is a gentleman's roast." Around it, she arranged side dishes that balanced the heaviness of the meat. Red cabbage stewed with apples and cloves, sweet and sour in perfect harmony. Cauliflower in white sauce, smooth and pale, dotted with nutmeg. Mashed parsnips, whipped light and flecked with butter. Roasted potatoes, crisped to a golden shell. the kitchen filled with warmth so deep it felt almost festive. Bessie stood near the fire, her cheeks pink from the heat, while Tom polished the serving lids until he could see his reflection. Dessert that night was a procession of splendour, Margaret's quiet rebellion against the notion that fine sweetness belonged only to the French. She began with a trifle layered with sponge, custard, and currants, the top crowned with whipped cream. Next came a pear tart, its fruit fanned like petals, glazed in honey and apricot jam until it caught the candlelight like stained glass. At the last moment, she decided to add a baked lemon pudding, its crust sugared, its interior warm and fragrant. "For the mistress," she said softly. "She likes something that bites back." Alice poured the brandy for flaming, her hands steady now where once they had trembled. Margaret nodded with quiet pride. "Good girl. Remember, the flames only frightening the first time." The pudding went up last, its blue fire flickering under the high silver lid. When the door closed behind the footman, Margaret finally exhaled. The servants' supper that followed was far humbler but no less satisfying. They shared the extra red cabbage, some slices of the venison too small for presentation, and the heel of the pear tart. The taste of the evening's triumph hung in the air as they ate, the laughter softer, the fatigue easier to bear. Tom, always bold, raised his mug. "To cook, queen of suppers." "Mind your tongue," said Margaret, though her eyes shone. "Queens wear crowns. I wear aprons." Bessie giggled. "Then it's the apron that rules us all." Alice leaned forward, smiling. "We'd follow it anywhere." The laughter that followed was honest and full, echoing against the low ceiling. Later, when the last dish was scrubbed clean and the fire had burned to quiet embers, Margaret lingered. The kitchen smelled of triumph, a soft mixture of wine, butter, and satisfaction. The house above slept, bellies full, and below, her little world lay still and orderly once again. She sat at the long table, rubbing her hands absently, and listened to the faint sigh of the chimney. Tomorrow, she thought, would bring its own demands. Another breakfast, another luncheon, another dance between hunger and grace. But tonight, she allowed herself one small indulgence. A spoonful of the trifle, cool and sweet against her tongue. She closed her eyes, savouring it, the faint taste of wine and cream mingling with the warmth of the fire. Then, with her usual calm, she rose, folded her apron, and whispered to the empty kitchen, "Rest well, my loves. We've done fine work today." The next morning began with a heaviness that was not the weather's fault. A faint drizzle hissed against the kitchen windows, and the grey light seemed to press down on the stone walls. Yet even before the fire had fully caught, Margaret Wicklow sensed the day would test her mettle. She was cutting butter into flour for the morning's scones when the scullery door banged open and a drenched footman appeared, his hair dripping onto the flagstones. "Message from the stables cook," he gasped. "Her ladyship's cousin, Lord Fitzalan, is arrived from London. No word ahead. Carriage just pulled in." Margaret froze mid-motion, her knife still half buried in the dough. An unannounced guest meant one thing: chaos. She closed her eyes briefly. "Of course he has," she said dryly. "London men always arrive hungry and uninvited." Without raising her voice, she turned to Alice. "Wake the kitchen proper. We'll need a full dinner fit for company by evening, and luncheon if he expects to be fed before the ink's dry on his excuses." Breakfast had barely finished when the household above began to rattle with preparations. Bells rang like a storm. Footmen scurried. Below stairs, Margaret set her team in motion with the calm precision of a general. For luncheon, she planned something quick but fine enough to pass for forethought. Chicken fricassee with cream and white wine, spinach tarts baked in the smaller dishes, delicate and crisp, stewed apricots in syrup for sweetness. The kitchen came alive at once. Bessie fetched the cream from the cool pantry, Tom plucked and dressed the chickens, and Alice rolled pastry with determined speed. The air thickened with steam, and the smell of butter melting into flour. Margaret stood at the range, wooden spoon in hand, stirring the sauce for the fricassee, a smooth, glossy concoction of wine, stock, and cream. "The trick," she said to Alice over the hiss of the fire, "is to let it coat the back of the spoon like silk. Thin sauce shows a thin cook." Alice nodded. sweating but steady. By noon the dishes were arranged, the chicken tender and pale beneath its blanket of sauce, the spinach tarts puffed high, the apricots glowing amber in their bowls. When the footman came for the trays, Margaret stopped them with a glance. "Tell the butler the gentleman will not find London cooking here," she said. "He'll find better." The quiet that followed the tray's departure was brief. Barely had the kitchen begun to cool when the butler descended again, looking harried. "Cook, the pantry delivery's delayed. No sugar till tomorrow." The dray horse threw a shoe outside Basingstoke. A ripple of alarm passed through the room. No sugar meant no puddings, no glazes, no sweet tea for the drawing-room. Margaret's brow furrowed only a moment. "Then we'll do without." She turned toward the shelf and began sorting jars. "We've honey. We've molasses. We'll manage sweetness from the good Lord's pantry instead of man's." Alice blinked. "You'll make desserts with honey, cook?" "With honey, yes, and wit. We'll make gingerbread with treacle for the servants and for the family, baked apples with honeyed cream. Let them think it rustic. They'll call it country elegance by supper." The others grinned, admiration hidden under obedience. By late afternoon, the kitchen had found its rhythm again. Margaret's gingerbread was dark and fragrant, the scent of cloves and molasses filling the air until even the butler lingered too long near the oven. The baked apples glowed red and gold, their skins splitting gently under the heat, the honey inside caramelizing to a syrup that perfumed the room. Meanwhile, preparations for the evening dinner took shape. Margaret decided to play bold, a statement to remind Lord Fitzalan that refinement lived just as strongly in the country as in any London townhouse. She planned oxtail soup, thick and savoury, salmon with caper butter, a nod to the sea despite their inland home, roast goose with chestnut stuffing, carrots and turnips glazed in cider, and her honey-based desserts, the baked apples and gingerbread, paired with cream whipped so firm it could stand a spoon upright. "Let the man go back to London bragging," she said as she basted the goose. "They'll say the countryside feeds its guests like kings." By the time the footman carried the first trays upstairs, the kitchen smelled divine, roasted meat, wine, and sweet spice layered into the air like music. The servants, though tired, glowed with satisfaction. When the door finally closed behind the last tray, Alice leaned against the table, flushed and smiling. "Do you think the London gentleman will notice it's all honey, not sugar?" Margaret wiped her hands on her apron. "If he does, he'll think it's fashion. If he doesn't, then I've done my work too well." The others laughed. Later that night, as the kitchen cooled and the lamps dimmed, Margaret sat alone by the embers. A faint murmur drifted from upstairs, voices mellowed by wine, laughter soft against the distant harpsichord. She sipped her tea and smiled to herself. A kitchen without sugar, a guest without warning, a day without rest, and yet not one dish had failed. That was her kind of victory, quiet, invisible, absolute. She leaned back, letting the warmth of the fire brush her face, and whispered to the coals, "We held the house again, my beauties. We always do." As the years slipped quietly onward, Margaret Wicklow's kitchen remained the constant heart of Haverly House, its hum, its warmth, its pulse of life beneath the grandeur above. Seasons turned, faces changed, and children grew into masters and mistresses, yet still the scent of her bread, her soups, her careful hand lingered in every corner. She never sought fame, only perfection, never chased praise, only peace. And when her hair turned silver and her steps slowed, those who passed through her kitchen, servants, maids, and even the family themselves, spoke her name with the kind of reverence reserved for those who shape the world without ever asking to be seen. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the fire glowed low and the first kettle began to sing, it was said you could still feel her presence there, calm, steady, eternal, the reigning spirit of the kingdom below stairs.